thank you. I am very happy to be here. Thank you all for such an inspiring couple of days already. I feel like I remember the first year, and it's getting to the point, it's sort of like remembering being one of those people who remembers Steve Jobs in the garage, and it's like when it all began, and now here we are, growing and growing. Amy asked me to talk a little bit about disasters and about what I've seen reporting for the last few years. We're going to have a conversation in a few minutes, so I'm just going to talk for 10 minutes or so about risk. It's the part of the theme here. I'm going to go light on the opportunity part of it and leave that for the conversation afterwards. But I think, especially given what we're seeing today here, 2 days ago, I was on the phone with my mom, who lives in Redding, California, where the car fire is burning, and trying to decide whether or not she should evacuate or not. So this is really becoming, part of the everyday conversation in a way that even people like myself, who've been thinking about climate change for a long time, couldn't really imagine. And I want to talk a little bit about that and about where we're headed. I want to start with my book about sea level rise, which is obviously not a pressing problem here in Idaho, but it is a pretty big problem in the world. And it's a book that really started with disaster for me. I've been writing about climate change for 10 or 15 years, thought about sea level rise, but never thought about it as anything urgent, no big deal, something that's going to slowly happen and, over a long period of time. And then Hurricane Sandy hit New York. I wasn't in the city that day, but I went down the day after. And I saw what 9 feet of water, which is what we got in Lower Manhattan, could do to a city. And I saw the people carrying their soggy mattresses out, and the cars were still aquariums. And it was a striking scene. And I called a friend of mine who's a scientist at Columbia, because I knew I was going to write about this, and just to bat around some ideas. And he said, well, one way to think about Hurricane Sandy is as a kind of dress rehearsal for sea level rise. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, the 9 feet that we got in Lower Manhattan is about what we're thinking of as the high end for the end of the century. So imagine that water coming in, and instead of going out in an hour or two, it just stays there. And I was like, holy shit, that's kind of a scary thought. And then he said, well, you want to really blow your mind, go have that same thought experiment in Miami. And I was like, why? And he said, just go to Miami and you will see. So being a good journalist, I went to Miami and I saw. And I was there for about 6 hours, and it occurred to me, it was very obvious to me that Miami is totally doomed if you take climate change seriously, if you take sea level rise seriously. You have a population of over 3 million people living in South Florida on a very flat limestone pancake that is essentially a kind of Swiss cheese. The water, you can't build seawalls there because the water will go right underneath it because of the porous limestone. And you have a lot of really, really valuable real estate right on the water. So being the journalist that I am, I wrote a story for Rolling Stone with the very subtle title, Goodbye Miami. It kicked off a bit of a shitstorm. I tell my kids, if you ever find dad in a car in a ditch with the brake lines cut in a kind of Karen Silkwood scenario, go to the Miami Realtors Association and start there with but that experience in Miami made me think about, well, how's the rest of the world dealing with sea level rise, and how's it dealing with? And I thought of sea level rise as a kind of just one of the impacts of climate change, but one that hadn't been sort of thought about and appreciated the consequences of it enough. So I started traveling around and decided to do this book, which looks at sea level rise from a global perspective. One of the first places I went was Greenland, because when you think about sea level rise, the issue is really the big, the 2 poles, what's happening in Greenland and Antarctica. And this is very pertinent to what's happening today, because one of the reasons I went to Greenland on this particular trip was to look at the impact of wildfire soot on the melting of the ice in Greenland in particular. The soot drifts up into the stratosphere and comes down on the ice in Greenland, and the blackening of the ice increases, absorbs more heat, causes the ice to melt faster. So we're like right now today in the middle of one of these feedback loops that's going to have an impact on what's happening in Greenland and ice around the world. I went to Venice, watched the water come up in Piazza San Marco while I was sitting there having my cappuccino, and the water came up and just like rose right into Piazza San Marco. Blew my mind. I was jet lagged. I thought I was sort of hallucinating. But it happens all the time there on high tides. Venice is, of course, a city that's hugely at risk, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. I went to the Marshall Islands, where sea level rise is not a problem of real estate or your favorite beach going underwater. It's an existential problem about how they will live, what will happen to their country, what does it mean to be a nation underwater? Can you have a virtual Marshall Islands in Fiji or Arkansas or whatever? These are very powerful questions. Went to Alaska with this guy. We had a good conversation. It was at the moment he was trying to build support for the Paris Agreement. It was September of 2015. He and I sat in a little classroom, an empty classroom in Kotzebue, Alaska for an hour and a half, him and I in two little blue plastic chairs talking about climate change. It was amazing and surreal, but not as surreal as thinking about what that conversation would be like with our current president. But the most important person that I met, I think, and I want to connect to what I want to talk about here briefly, is this guy Patrick, who I met in Lagos, in some of the water slums there. And what Patrick, I spent a couple of weeks with him and his family living in here, where you see. And what I really understood from him was that I would talk to them about sea level rise and storm surge and how they dealt with all this. And he and his family were like, we don't care if the sea level rise is 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet. We'll just we can fix our house in an afternoon. We just put bigger sticks and raise it up, and no big deal. We don't care. And it really occurred to me that the problem with sea level rise, more broadly with the stuff we're going to talk about today, is that we've built all this infrastructure in places that we shouldn't, right? Sea level rise is not a problem. The flooding of South Florida is not a problem if nobody's living there, if you don't have the Fontainebleau Hotel there, if you don't have Norman Foster, condos and things there. The problem is the way that we've built our world, right? And he really made me understand this. It's particularly true with, is that me beeping? Yeah. It's particularly true with sea level rise, but it's true with a lot of things. And it leads me to this idea that I think is really important, that natural disasters are natural. That we don't need, the reason that sea level rise is a problem is because of all the stuff we've built with the idea that the shore is here, the water is here, and never will that change, right? Same thing in Puerto Rico. I was in Puerto Rico. I've been spending a couple of months in Puerto Rico writing about the rebuilding of Puerto Rico, which was, of course, devastated. But the devastation in Puerto Rico has to do with the way Puerto Rico was built. We had this grid that is very fragile, that was built in the 1950s, that hasn't been updated, was not resilient at all. We have a lot of structures, housing, things that we'll talk about here on the panel in just a moment, that there was no building codes where they have them, but they have like 3 building inspectors on the entire island. It's the way we construct our world that makes it so vulnerable, right? And same with the wildfires, right? We have been building, I think 60% of the houses that have been built since 1990 in America are on the urban wildfire sort of interface in zones that we know are fire zones that are high risk. So even though we're in this era of climate change, even though we have conferences like this, even though we talk about it all the time, we're still building a lot of dumb stuff in dumb places. And we're making the risk greater, right? It's what a guy that I know at an insurance company calls manufacturing catastrophe. We're making these problems right now. And it's continuing. In Houston, after Hurricane Harvey, they're building more stuff in the floodplains. It's insane, right? Here in Montana, they're building more houses in high fire risk zones, right? In California, they're building lots of houses in places where they don't know what the water supply will be. It's a kind of organized suicide that we're doing here. And it's a question of like not understanding these risks that we're facing and that is emblematic today with these fires. And this is the second point I want to make, and then I'll end this, which is that I think that we're moving into a time where we're playing by entirely different rules. The climate is changing very fast, and no one knows what those new rules are, right? And we don't know how fast these changes are coming and what the consequences will really be, right? And the great example of this is Ellicott City, Maryland, which many of you may know about. In 2016, it had devastating floods. It had 8 inches of rain in like 4 hours. 1 in a 1,000-year rainstorm. This is a photo, wiped out the city, historic city in Maryland. And you think, okay, that's a once in a 1,000-year storm. We're good for another 999 years, right? So this year, it happened again. Even more rain, right? They got 10, they don't know for sure, maybe Paul can tell us later, he probably has better information, but something like 10 or 12 inches in 3 or 4 hours. So you have 2 back-to-back 1 in a 1,000-year storms, basically, right? A pretty clear sign that we're living in a different world than we were before, and that the risks are much greater than we understand. And it's the same thing with sea level rise. There's these projections. You know, when I first started this book, I thought, oh, sea level rise is this slow, this slow linear thing. But in fact, we can look back at the geologic record. There's been times not so long ago, 12,000 years ago, which is yesterday from a climate point of view, where we had 13 feet of sea level rise in a single century. Right? 13 feet is catastrophic, right? It is catastrophic for coastal cities around the world. And, you know, I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen now, but we're in a regime where things are changing very fast with the ice sheets, in West Antarctica in particular. And I know I spent a lot of time with all the best ice scientists. That's sort of what I've been doing for the last 3 years. And they're freaked out. They're freaked out. They're particularly freaked out about West Antarctica and about how fast that can go. And as Richard Alley, who's one of arguably the best ice scientists in the world, said to me, we're at a time where there's no human analog for what we're facing, the world we're dealing with. And this is sort of emblematic of that. The last thing, this idea is billions of dollars will be spent on adaptation and resilience. Some of it will be well spent, a lot of it will not be. This is one of the things I really learned in working on this book. I have resilience in quotes here because when you think about sea level rise and things, resilience is a complicated phrase that I have some trouble with, but you know, there's a lot of money being spent on raising houses and doing things like this, which is all good, but you know, raising houses doesn't help if the entire neighborhood is flooded all around you. If the airport doesn't work because it's underwater, if the streets are flooded, if your neighbors' houses are all abandoned, if you have crocodiles swimming through the kindergarten classrooms, right? I mean, so the Navy has faced this in Norfolk, where I was with John Kerry, Secretary Kerry, on the USS. What was the name of the ship? I forgot. Well, one of the battleships. And Kerry, of course, understands the risk of sea level rise really well. Norfolk Naval Base is the biggest naval base in the country, and it's hugely at risk of sea level rise. I was with Secretary Kerry standing on the bridge of this battleship when he asked the head of the base, how much time do we have for this base? And the head of the base said 20 to 40 years. And this base will be gone. And that is a very, very scary and profound thing. And it also it illustrates what I mean here, in that the Navy has tons of money, right? The Navy can spend tons of money to build walls and to save the naval base. But it can't, but it's figuring out that in order to save the naval base, it has to save the entire area of Norfolk, because if no one can get to work, it doesn't matter. If the railroads are underwater and they can't get the munitions and the steel and all the other stuff, it doesn't matter if they save the base. So to save the base means saving the entire region of Norfolk, and that's a whole other question that they have to deal with and they're kind of grappling with now. Another great example of this is walls, building walls, right? Building walls, as we know, is a very popular pastime in America right now. But building walls brings up all kinds of problems, social justice problems. This is the wall they're talking about in Lower Manhattan. It's called the Big U. They hate it when I call it a wall. They prefer it to be called a barrier with amenities. So barriers with amenities have problems because if you're behind a barrier with amenities, you're happy, right? If you're on on 39th Street there on the east side, you're happy because you're behind your barrier with amenities. If you're on 46th Street, you're not happy because you're not behind your barrier with amenities, and you wonder, why didn't they build this barrier with amenities for me also, right? And then if you're in Red Hook, Brooklyn, you're like, why don't you have fancy Danish architects designing barriers with amenities for me? Why is it that only the Goldman Sachs people here get the barrier with amenities? So there's a lot of really complicated issues with things like walls. This is what they're doing in Miami. This is, again, an example of money perhaps not well spent on resilience and adaptation. They've decided to raise the streets in parts of Miami 2.5 feet, creating this weird sort of elevated streets, and then the stores and shops and condos are down below. They spent $500 million on this project, and people are like, what the fuck did you do to our neighborhood? It's very strange to walk through there where you're going up and down these stairs and you're going down into the stores, and it's all dependent on these pumps working. And when I was there last year, the pumps didn't work, so the flooding was even worse because of this elevated stuff. And it's just like a complete debacle in many ways. And the biggest debacle in this is in Venice, where they've spent over $6 billion building what one engineer calls the Ferrari on the seafloor, which is this barrier at the edge of the lagoon that it goes down when there's not high tides or storm surges and comes up when there is high tides and storm surges. And the idea is that this will protect the city and you won't have to look at it the rest of the time, right? They don't want to have to look at it. So they spent 25 years engineering this incredibly sophisticated barrier system. They spent over $6 billion on it. About $1 billion went to ski condos and things for contractors and local politicians and things. About 250 of them went to jail as a result of that. But it's built. It's almost fully operational now. But the problem is they forgot to factor in sea level rise. They spent 25 years dealing with this, and there's no sea level rise. So it's going to be obsolete by the time it's finished. And it's a great example of a ton of money being spent on a problem without really thinking accurately about what the risks are and what the consequences are. So I just want to wrap up with a couple of last thoughts, and then we can have our conversation. I think it's really important to understand that climate change is not an alien invasion, that it doesn't require gamma guns for like little green people that we have to invent. It's all stuff that we know how to do, right? It's like moving to higher ground, building in more resilient ways, rethinking our political structure. It's all stuff that we know how to do if we have the will and the desire to do it. Yes, we'd love to have cheaper solar panels and all that. It's not anti-innovation, but it's not required. We don't need gamma guns. We're talking a lot about risk, and one of the things that I learned with this book is the importance of making risk transparent to everyone. And that's really something that is, I think, the most important thing so that people can make their own decisions about whether they want to live in wildfire zones, whether they want to live in flood areas. And that goes to the problems of flood insurance and the lousy FEMA maps and all this information that people in this room have, but the broader public doesn't have, partly because of the contorted politics of our conversations about climate and everything else. But I think that making risk transparent is just hugely important. We talk a lot about innovation. One of the things that I learned during this is that speed really matters here, because this is not, everyone talks about often about, if we can put a man on the moon, we can solve climate change, and there's some truth to that in certain ways, but the problem with climate change is that we're in a race against time, right? This is not like, oh, well, we'll get to Mars one of these days. We'll just figure out we'll let Elon work on it, then Elon's son will work on it, and we'll get there, and it'll be fun. We're loading our atmosphere with carbon. That carbon is staying in the atmosphere for a very long time. We're changing the planet for our kids, our grandkids, and innovation, the speed of innovation, of dealing with this fast, is really, really, really important. And then the last thing is this, which I get in a lot of trouble for talking about, but is, I think, indisputably true, is that retreat is not a dirty word. That there are places in our world, in the mountains, in coasts, in flood areas, in wildfire zones, where we should not be living, where we have to understand that we can't live, and that the risks are, or at least if we want to live there, that you understand what those risks are. And this is a hugely controversial idea in coastal areas all around the world, because if you talk about retreat from Miami, if you're the mayor of Miami, it's very hard to win on a platform of like, we're going to shrink this city. That is not a winning platform. So anytime there's any kind of flooding event, what you get is we're going to rebuild better and stronger than before and put more people at risk, and the wheel of catastrophe goes on. So that's how I want to end this, and now I guess we're going to have a conversation about some of the opportunities that disaster provides us. Thanks.